There is a particular quality to California summer nights in the 1,970 seconds that anyone who lived through them will never forget. The windows left open to catch the breeze, the sound of sprinklers shutting off at midnight, the way headlights swept across bedroom walls as late commuters made their way home through the quiet suburban streets of Sacramento. It was a time when doors were left unlocked, when neighbors knew each other by name, when children played until the streetlights flickered on, and when the idea of a stranger slipping into your home while you slept seemed like something from a horror film, not the evening news. And then, in the summer of 1976, a presence began to move through the eastern suburbs of Sacramento County, a shadow that would eventually stretch across the entire state of California, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives that would take more than 4 decades to trace back to its source. The man who created this trail would eventually be known by many names: the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the Original Night Stalker, the Diamond Knot Killer, and finally the name that would stick, the one that would come to represent the full scope of his crimes, the Golden State Killer. This is a story about patience, about the long, slow work of investigation that spans generations, about the victims who carried their wounds for decades without ever knowing if they would see justice, about a quiet revolution in DNA technology that would change criminal investigation forever, and about the moment when a 72-year-old man, living unremarkably in a modest home in Citrus Heights, finally heard the knock that had been coming for 40 years. The first confirmed attack attributed to the man who would become the Golden State Killer occurred on the 18th of June, 1976, in Rancho Cordova. A woman was awakened in her home by an intruder who had entered through a window. He was wearing a ski mask and carried a knife. He bound her with ligatures he had brought with him. He raped her, and then he vanished into the night, leaving behind evidence that would sit in a storage room for decades, waiting for science to catch up with crime. In the months that followed, the attacks multiplied. The pattern was consistent enough that investigators quickly realized they were dealing with a single perpetrator. He would prowl neighborhoods for days, or sometimes weeks before striking, studying the layout of homes, learning the routines of residents. He would sometimes enter houses when no one was home, unlocking windows or sliding glass doors for later access. In some cases, he would leave lengths of rope or twine hidden inside the home. He seemed to know everything about his victims before they knew anything about him. He knew when husbands would be away. He knew which homes had dogs. He knew the layouts of bedrooms, the locations of telephones, the places where valuables were kept. Anyone who has lived in a small community during a time of crisis knows how quickly fear can spread. By late 1976, the eastern suburbs of Sacramento were gripped by a kind of collective anxiety that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. Women stopped going out alone after dark. Men stayed home from work, unable to leave their families unprotected. Hardware stores sold out of locks, chains, security bars. Gun sales spiked. The local newspaper printed stories daily about the East Area Rapist, as the media had begun calling him. And each story seemed to bring the nightmare closer. What made the East Area Rapist particularly terrifying was not just the violence of his attacks, but the psychological sadism that accompanied them. He did not simply want to assault his victims. He wanted to control them, to terrorize them, to leave them with a fear that would persist long after the physical wounds had healed. He would spend hours in victims' homes, taking breaks to eat their food, to rummage through their belongings, to call them by name. He would threaten to kill children sleeping in the next room. He would whisper threats through clenched teeth, his voice high and strained, telling victims he would return if they contacted police. And in many cases, he did return. Weeks, months, sometimes years later, his victims would pick up the telephone to hear heavy breathing, or a whispered threat, or simply the sound of someone listening. It is difficult not to imagine what those calls must have felt like. The sudden certainty that he had not forgotten, that he was still out there, still watching, still present in their lives, even after the physical violation had ended. By 1977, the attacks had expanded beyond the eastern suburbs. The rapist struck in areas throughout Sacramento County, and then in nearby counties as well. He assaulted women in Stockton, in Modesto, in Davis. The pattern remained consistent, the methodology almost ritualistic in its precision. He would awaken victims with a flashlight shining in their eyes. He would bind them with pre-cut lengths of rope or shoelaces using a distinctive diamond knot that investigators would later recognize as a potential clue. He would stack dishes on the backs of male victims if couples were present, warning them that if he heard the dishes rattle while he assaulted their wives or girlfriends, he would kill everyone in the house. The cruelty of this particular detail is something that stays with you. The men who were bound and made to listen helpless while someone they loved was assaulted in the next room. The way the clatter of dishes became a sound that some of them could never hear again without feeling the return of that helplessness. In December of 1977, someone claiming to be the East Area rapist sent a poem to the Sacramento Bee newspaper, to the Sacramento mayor's office, and to a local television station. The poem, titled Excitement's Crave, was poorly written and difficult to interpret, rambling through verses about morality, society, and the thrill of transgression. Whether or not it was actually written by the rapist was never definitively established, but its arrival sent another wave of fear through a community already saturated with dread. That same month, a masked man telephoned police to announce he would strike on Watt Avenue that night. Officers flooded the area, setting up roadblocks and patrols, but the man eluded them. He seemed to enjoy the game, the back and forth with law enforcement, the demonstration of his own cunning. He was taunting them, and they knew it, and there was nothing they could do. On the 2nd of February 1978, everything changed again. Brian and Katie Maggiore were young. Brian was a sergeant in the Air Force stationed nearby. Katie was his wife, his high school sweetheart, the person he had chosen to build his life with. On that February evening, they were doing what countless young couples do on quiet weeknights. They were walking their dog, a poodle named Thumper, through their Rancho Cordova neighborhood. The streets were familiar. The houses belonged to people they knew. There was no reason to feel anything but safe. What happened next remains partly unclear even decades later. Investigators believe the Maggiores encountered a man who was prowling the neighborhood, perhaps preparing for another attack, perhaps in the process of committing a burglary. Whatever they saw, whatever they said, the man responded with violence. Brian was shot first. Katie ran screaming for help, but the man chased her down in a backyard and shot her in the head. Their dog was found later shivering in a neighbor's swimming pool. For the investigators who had been tracking the East Area rapist, the Maggiore murders represented a devastating escalation. Their suspect had always been violent, had always been terrifying, but until that night, he had never killed during his attacks. Now they understood that the threat was even greater than they had feared. The man they were hunting was capable of murder, and he had demonstrated that capability in the most brutal way possible. The attacks continued through 1978 and into 1979, spreading now to the San Francisco Bay Area. The rapists struck in Concord and San Jose, in Danville and Fremont, in Walnut Creek. Each attack followed the same pattern. The same methodology, the same aftermath of terror and trauma. Investigators from multiple jurisdictions tried to coordinate sharing information and comparing notes, but the killer remained elusive. He seemed to know how to avoid detection, how to leave crime scenes without leaving behind the kind of evidence that would identify him. He moved through communities like smoke, present one moment and gone the next, leaving behind only fear and questions. Some people wonder why no one could catch him. The answer lies partly in the era, in the limitations of 1,970 seconds, forensic science, in the lack of centralized databases and coordinated information sharing between police departments. But it lies also in the killer's own cunning. He had studied police procedures, it seemed. He knew how long it would take for officers to respond to a call. He knew where roadblocks would likely be set up and how to avoid them. He knew how to blend into neighborhoods, how to move through the night without attracting attention. He was patient, methodical, and deeply intelligent in the particular way that predators can be intelligent. He was also, as investigators would later learn, a police officer himself. The last confirmed attack by the East Area Rapist in Northern California occurred on the 5th of July 1979 in Danville. After that night, the attacks in the Sacramento area and the Bay Area stopped. The man who had terrorized communities for 3 years seemed to have vanished. Some investigators hoped he had died or been imprisoned for some other crime or simply moved away. Others suspected with a dread that would prove justified that he had not stopped at all. He had simply moved. On the 1st of October, 1979, an intruder broke into a home in Goleta, near Santa Barbara in Southern California. He tied up the couple living there, a man and a woman who had been asleep in their bedroom. The attack followed a pattern that investigators in Northern California would have recognized immediately. The masked intruder, the pre-cut ligatures, the deliberate terrorization of the victims. But something was different this time. The man heard the intruder muttering to himself, saying, "I'll kill him," under his breath, and managed to escape from his bindings. He and his girlfriend fled, screaming for help, and the attacker ran off into the night. They had survived. They were among the last victims who would. Less than 3 months later, on the 30th of December, 1979, Dr. Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning were found dead in Offerman's condominium in Goleta. They had been shot in bed, their hands bound with the same type of ligatures used in the October attack. Dr. Offerman, a psychologist, appeared to have struggled against his bindings before being killed. Investigators noted that the killer had brought a dog with him, a white German Shepherd, that he fed leftover Christmas turkey from the victim's refrigerator. He had also stolen a bicycle from a neighboring property to make his escape. The Offerman-Manning murders marked the beginning of a new phase of terror. The man who had spent 3 years as a rapist in Northern California had become a murderer in Southern California, and he would continue killing for nearly 7 years. On the 13th of March 1980, Lyman and Charlene Smith were found murdered in their home in Ventura. Lyman, 43 years old, was an attorney who had been about to be appointed as a judge. Charlene, 33, was an interior designer. They had been bound with drapery cord and bludgeoned to death with a log from their own fireplace. The bedroom alarm clock was still going off when Lyman's 12-year-old son from a previous marriage arrived to mow the lawn and discovered their bodies. The bindings used on Charlene Smith featured the same diamond knot that investigators had seen in the East Area Rapist attacks. For the first time, someone began to wonder whether the crimes in Northern California might be connected to the murders in the South. But without DNA technology, without the ability to definitively link evidence across jurisdictions, In August of 1980, newlyweds Keith and Patrice Harrington were found bludgeoned to death in their home in Dana Point in Orange County. Keith was 24, a medical student. Keith's father discovered their bodies when he stopped by to have dinner with them. In February of 1981, Manuela Witthuhn, 28 years old, was raped and murdered in her Irvine home. Her husband was in the hospital at the time, recovering from an illness, and she was alone. The killer had probably watched the house for days, learning her routine, waiting for the opportunity to strike. In July of 1981, Sherry Domingo, 35, and Gregory Sanchez, 27, were murdered in Domingo's home in Goleta. They had been dating and Sanchez had come to visit that night. The killer bludgeoned Sanchez more than 20 times, an explosion of violence that suggested rage or perhaps recognition that Sanchez had tried to fight back. And then for nearly 5 years, nothing. The attack stopped. The killer seemed to have vanished again, this time for good. Investigators continued to work the cases, comparing notes, developing theories, but without new evidence, without a break in the pattern. Some of the lead detectives retired. New cases demanded attention. The memories of the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker, as the Southern California Killer had been dubbed, began to fade from public consciousness. Until the 4th of May 1986. Janelle Cruz was 18 years old. She had recently graduated from a Job Corps program in Utah, earning her high school diploma and starting to plan for her future. She was working at a pizza parlor in Irvine, studying to become a legal secretary, beginning to build the life she had dreamed about. When her family went on vacation to Mexico, she stayed behind partly because of work. She had a friend come over that evening, a male co-worker from the pizza parlor. The noise that Janelle and her friend had heard earlier, the sound from the garage that they had dismissed as nothing, had probably been the killer entering the property. Janelle's body was found the next evening by the realtor. She had been bound, sexually assaulted, and bludgeoned to death. A pipe wrench from the property was missing and was believed to be the murder weapon. She was the Golden State Killer's youngest known victim. After the murder of Janelle Cruz, the killer disappeared completely. No more attacks, no more phone calls, no more evidence that he was still active. For 32 years, the families of his victims lived with the knowledge that their loved one's killer was out there somewhere, probably living a normal life, probably walking past people every day who had no idea what he had done. The detectives who had worked the cases retired, grew old, some of them passed away. The evidence sat in storage. Biological samples collected from crime scenes, waiting for technology that did not yet exist. In 2001, the first major breakthrough occurred. DNA testing had advanced to the point where investigators could compare samples from different crime scenes with a level of precision that was impossible in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds. When they analyzed DNA from the East Area Rapist attacks and the original Night Stalker murders, the results were conclusive. The same person had committed both series of crimes. The rapist who had terrorized Sacramento and the killer who had murdered at least 10 people in Southern California were the same man. This revelation was both a breakthrough and a burden. Investigators now knew they were dealing with one of the most prolific serial predators in American history. At least 50 rapes, at least 12 murders, spanning more than a decade and covering hundreds of miles. But they still had no name, no suspect, no way to identify the person responsible. The DNA told them who they were looking for in genetic terms, but it did not tell them where to find him. Over the next 17 years, investigators continued to work the case. They uploaded the DNA profile to criminal databases, hoping for a match. They followed leads, investigated suspects, eliminated possibilities one by one. Dozens of men were considered and cleared, some through DNA comparison, others through alibis or other evidence. Every lead seemed to end in frustration. During this time, a true crime writer named Michelle McNamara became obsessed with the case. McNamara, who had founded a website called True Crime Diary and had a gift for meticulous research, began corresponding with investigators, interviewing victims, and building a comprehensive picture of the crimes. She was particularly struck by the disjointed nature of the case. The way the killer had accumulated so many different names in so many different jurisdictions, the way his full scope of terror had never been properly communicated to the public. In a 2013 article for Los Angeles Magazine, she gave him a new name, one that would finally capture the breadth of his crimes: the Golden State Killer. McNamara signed a book deal with HarperCollins to write about the case. She worked obsessively, spending long hours combing through documents, studying crime scene photographs, piecing together timelines. Her dedication to the case was total. She was having trouble sleeping. The violence she was researching had begun to invade her dreams. On the 21st of April 2016, Michelle McNamara died in her sleep at the age of 46. The cause was a combination of prescription drugs interacting with an undiagnosed heart condition. She had been about 2/3 of the way through her book. Her husband, comedian Patton Oswalt, made the decision to have the book completed by others who had worked with her, including investigator Paul Holes and journalist Billy Jensen. When I'll Be Gone in the Dark was published in February 2018, it became a bestseller, bringing new attention to a case that had gone unsolved for more than 40 years. The title came from a threat the killer had made to one of his victims, a 15-year-old girl named Chris Pedretti, whom he attacked in December of 1976. As he put a knife to her throat, he told her, "Do what I say, or I'll kill you, and be gone in the dark." The phrase captured something essential about him: the way he seemed to materialize from nowhere and vanish back into nothing, leaving behind only trauma and questions. 2 months after the book's publication, the questions finally got their answer. Paul Holes, the retired Contra Costa County investigator who had helped complete McNamara's book, in his final months before retirement, he had begun exploring a new approach. DNA technology had advanced again, and a new tool was available: genetic genealogy. By uploading a DNA profile to a public genealogy database called GEDmatch, where ordinary people shared their genetic information, in hopes of finding relatives and tracing their ancestry, investigators could potentially find distant relatives of the killer, people who shared enough DNA with him to indicate a family connection. The process was painstaking. Holes and genealogist Barbara Ray Venter uploaded the killer's DNA profile and found more than 100 distant matches, people who might be third or fourth cousins of the man they were seeking. From there, they began the slow work of building family trees, tracing bloodlines back through generations, looking for connections that might lead them to a suspect. It was like working a genealogical puzzle, with most of the pieces missing, but gradually branches of the family tree began to take shape. The tree that eventually led them to their suspect contained more than 1,000 names. In April 2018, one name rose to the top of the list. D'Angelo was 72 years old. He lived in a modest house in Citrus Heights, the very area where some of the East Area rapist attacks had occurred in the 1972. He had been married, had 3 daughters, had worked for years as a mechanic at a supermarket distribution center. He had also, investigators discovered, been a police officer in the 1972, serving first in Exeter and then in Auburn, California. He had been fired from the Auburn Force in 1979 after being caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent. The shoplifting arrest had occurred just months before his crimes shifted from Northern to Southern California. Before making an arrest, investigators needed to confirm that DeAngelo's DNA matched the samples from the crime scenes. They placed him under surveillance, watching his movements, waiting for an opportunity. DNA was collected from a tissue found in his curbside garbage and from the door handle of his car. Both samples matched. On the 24th of April 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights. The 72-year-old man who emerged was a frail-looking figure, nothing like the athletic predator who had terrorized California decades earlier. But DNA does not lie, and the evidence was conclusive. The Golden State Killer had finally been identified. For the survivors and the families of victims, the arrest was overwhelming. People who had spent 40 years wondering if they would ever know who had attacked them or killed their loved ones suddenly had a face, a name, an answer. Keith Smith, whose sister Katie had been murdered with her husband Brian in 1978, told reporters that DeAngelo had had all of the control the entire time. And now we have that control. Jane Carson Sandler, who had been raped in 1976, while her 3-year-old son was in the next room. That's a long time, 44 years. But I went from being a victim to a survivor to a thriver. Michelle Cruz, whose 18-year-old sister Janelle had been the killer's final victim, spoke of the relief she felt after decades of fear and uncertainty. "I'm so thankful this journey is finally over," she said. "And I can rest and go to bed at night and rest easier knowing that he's in jail and he'll never walk free again." The prosecution took more than 2 years to prepare. Investigators spent months reviewing evidence, taking statements, coordinating between the multiple jurisdictions where crimes had occurred. The case was massive, encompassing more than 1.3 million pages of discovery, covering crimes in 11 California counties, spanning more than a decade. A trial was expected to take years. In June 2020, DeAngelo agreed to plead guilty in exchange for having the death penalty taken off the table. On June 29, a ballroom at California State University, Sacramento, that had been converted into a courtroom to accommodate social distancing during the COVID-19 pandemic, the 74-year-old DeAngelo entered guilty pleas to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping to commit robbery. He also admitted to more than 160 uncharged crimes, including dozens of rapes, burglaries, and attempted murders, for which the statute of limitations had expired. The sentencing hearing was held over 4 days in August 2020. Victims and family members were given the opportunity to read impact statements directly to the man who had changed their lives. They came in wheelchairs and on crutches, gray-haired, now decades removed from the young people they had been when he attacked them. They called him a monster, a coward, the devil incarnate. They described nightmares that had lasted 40 years. They described marriages that had ended, careers that had derailed, lives that had been bent and broken by what he had done. Some of them spoke of resilience, of the ways they had rebuilt themselves despite everything. Some spoke of forgiveness, not for his sake, but for their own, as a way of releasing the grip his crimes had maintained on their lives. Some refused to speak at all, unwilling to give him any more of their attention than he had already stolen. Through it all, DeAngelo sat in a wheelchair wearing an orange jail jumpsuit and a white face mask, refusing to look at the people addressing him. Prosecutors later released video footage showing that the wheelchair was a performance. In his cell, where he believed he was not being watched, DeAngelo moved normally, exercised regularly, showed none of the frailty he displayed in the courtroom. On the final day of the sentencing hearing, D'Angelo stood up from his wheelchair, removed his mask, and spoke for the first time. "I've listened to all your statements," he said. "Each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I have hurt. Thank you, Your Honor." They were the only words he would utter in court. Judge Michael Bowman sentenced D'Angelo to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty allowed under the plea agreement. "The impact statements will always be with me," the judge said. "I was moved by their grace qualities you clearly lack." D'Angelo was remanded to custody and transported to a state prison in the Central Valley, where he will spend whatever remains of his life. In the years since his arrest, investigators and journalists have continued to examine D'Angelo's history, looking for clues that might explain how a police officer became one of the most prolific serial predators in American history. What they have found is a life marked by violence, manipulation, and rage. D'Angelo was born in Bath, New York, in 1945. His childhood was reportedly difficult, marked by abuse from his parents and a traumatic incident in which, as a young boy, he witnessed his younger sister being sexually assaulted by two military servicemen. He served in the Navy during the Vietnam War, then attended college in California, earning a degree in criminal justice. He became engaged to a woman named Bonnie Colwell in 1970, but she broke off the engagement after he became abusive and manipulative. According to testimony at his sentencing hearing, Bonnie became the name he would cry out during some of his attacks, a detail that suggests his crimes may have been fueled in part by rage at her rejection. D'Angelo married another woman, Sharon Huddle, in 1973, and they had 3 daughters together. By all outward appearances, their life was ordinary. D'Angelo went to work, came home, played with his children. His family had no idea what he was doing in the night hours. No idea that the man sleeping beside them was responsible for terrorizing an entire state. Some people find this difficult to comprehend. How could someone lead such a completely double life? How could someone capable of such violence appear so normal? The questions have no satisfying answers. What we know is that D'Angelo was skilled at concealment, at compartmentalization, at presenting one face to the world while hiding another. His training as a police officer gave him knowledge that helped him evade detection. His marriage and children gave him the appearance of normalcy. A mask he wore as deliberately as the ski mask he donned during his attacks. What finally unmasked him was something he could not have anticipated: the revolution in genetic genealogy that made it possible to identify him through his relatives' DNA. D'Angelo never submitted his own DNA to a genealogy database, but enough of his distant relatives had that investigators were able to construct a family tree leading back to him. It was the culmination of decades of scientific advancement, a technology that did not exist when he committed his crimes, catching up with him 4 decades later. The Golden State Killer case has had lasting implications for criminal investigation. Since D'Angelo's arrest, genetic genealogy has been used to identify suspects in hundreds of cold cases across the country. The technique has raised questions about privacy and the ethics of using public DNA databases for law enforcement purposes. But it has also brought closure to families who had given up hope of ever learning who killed their loved ones. For the survivors of D'Angelo's attacks, closure is a complicated word. Some have said that his arrest and conviction allowed them to finally move forward. Others have said that no prison sentence can undo what was done to them, that the trauma persists, regardless of where their attacker sleeps at night. Phyllis Henneman, who was the East Area rapist's first known victim in Sacramento, attended D'Angelo's sentencing hearing, despite undergoing chemotherapy for cancer. Prosecutor Thien Ho remembers looking across the courtroom and seeing her sitting there with this twinkle in her eye. For the first time in 40 years, she got justice. 3 months later, she died. Chris Pedretti, who was 15 when DeAngelo attacked her in December 1976, told the court that his crimes had shaped her entire adult life. For 41 years, I struggled with extreme panic attacks, failed relationships, unhealthy coping mechanisms, few friends, and frequent job changes, she said. Though I have found my way to a happy and safe life, DeAngelo deserves his sentence of life, without parole, in the most dark and lonely containment. Your secrets have been exposed. Your double life is over. The world, and I mean the entire world, knows who you are and what you did. Elizabeth Hupp, formerly Elizabeth Snelling, was 16 years old when DeAngelo tried to kidnap her from her bedroom in Visalia in 1975. Her father, Claude Snelling, a journalism professor, heard the commotion and confronted the intruder. DeAngelo shot him twice. DeAngelo was able to live a normal life with his family for all those years, while my family and I could not be with my dad, Elizabeth told the court. I am so thankful that he will at least spend the rest of his miserable life in prison. Michelle Cruz described finding her sister Janelle's body. As a teenager, described the way the crime had shattered her family. Described spending 6 to 8 hours a day for years, researching the case, trying to find her sister's killer. At the sentencing hearing, she described the condition of Janelle's body in terms that were almost too painful to hear, the evidence of violence that had forced the family to keep the casket closed at her funeral. There are moments in this story when the weight of accumulated grief becomes almost unbearable. The thought of these survivors, many of them now in their 60s and 70s, still carrying wounds from attacks that happened when they were young. The thought of the family members who died before an arrest was ever made, who went to their graves without knowing who had killed their children, their siblings, their spouses. The thought of the communities that lived in fear for years, never knowing when the next attack might come. And yet there is something else in this story too. Something that might be called grace, or resilience, or simply the stubborn human refusal to be destroyed. The survivors who spoke at DeAngelo's sentencing hearing were not just victims reading testimony. They were people who had built lives despite what had been done to them, who had raised families and pursued careers and found ways to experience joy, even with the shadow of trauma hanging over them. They had waited decades for justice, and when it finally came, they stood up and claimed it. One of the most remarkable moments of the sentencing hearing came when Jane Carson Sandler, who had been raped in 1976, brought an unexpected guest. I've brought somebody here with me today that was also a victim, she told the court, and her name is Bonnie. Bonnie Colwell, DeAngelo's former fiancée, the woman whose rejection may have fueled his rage, stood up and faced him. It was the first time she had seen him in more than 40 years. The first time she had confronted the man she had once agreed to marry. The symbolism was powerful. The woman he had obsessed over, whose name he had cried out during attacks, was standing before him in a courtroom, no longer afraid, reclaiming her own story. Joseph DeAngelo is now incarcerated at Corcoran State Prison in the California Central Valley. He is held in a protective unit, separated from the general prison population for his own safety. Prosecutor Thien Ho, reflecting on the case, noted that DeAngelo is constantly looking over his shoulder, worried that somebody's going to attack him. So he's in his own version of hell, where he belongs. There are questions about the case that may never be answered. How many crimes did DeAngelo actually commit? The 13 murders and 50 rapes for which he was identified are almost certainly not the full total. Investigators believe there may be additional victims who never reported what happened to them, additional crimes that were never connected to the pattern. Why did he stop killing after 1986? Some have speculated that the birth of his second daughter that year changed something in him, or that a close call made him decide the risks had become too great. Why did he choose the victims he chose? For some, the answer seems clear, a matter of opportunity and vulnerability. For others, like Janelle Cruz, whose murder came 5 years after his previous crime, the reasons remain mysterious. What is clear is that the capture of the Golden State Killer represented a turning point in criminal investigation, a demonstration of what becomes possible when technology, persistence, and the refusal to give up converge. Paul Holes, the investigator who uploaded DeAngelo's DNA to GEDmatch, retired the day after surveillance began on DeAngelo's home. He spent his last official day as an investigator sitting in his car outside the house in Citrus Heights, looking at the home of the man he had spent years hunting, wondering whether to knock on the door. He decided to wait, to let the DNA confirmation come through, to make sure the case was airtight before moving forward. It was the right decision. The arrest, when it came, was clean and conclusive. Michelle McNamara did not live to see it. She died 2 years before DeAngelo was identified, 2 years before her book was published, 2 years before the world learned the name of the man she had spent years trying to find. In the final pages of I'll Be Gone in the Dark, completed by others after her death, "You will be caught," she wrote. "I may no longer be here. I may have died. I may be in a nursing home drooling oatmeal. But this story will not end with me. I know it. I feel it. It will end with you. The bedroom door closing. Your face. Your name. A flood of flashbulbs awaits you." She was right. On a spring evening in 2018, Joseph DeAngelo was taken into custody outside his home, and the flashbulbs went off, and the face was finally seen, and the name was finally known. The story that Michelle McNamara had given so much of herself to telling had reached its conclusion. The man who had promised to be gone in the dark was standing in the light at last. For the survivors and the families, what comes next is their own to decide. Some have written books. Some have become advocates for victims' rights. Some have retreated from public attention, preferring to process their experiences privately. The bonds formed among them during the decades of uncertainty, the community created by shared trauma, persist even now that the case is closed. They gather at anniversaries and court dates, united by an experience they never asked for, but have learned to carry together. The California suburbs where these crimes occurred have changed in the 40-plus years since the attacks began. Rancho Cordova and Citrus Heights and Goleta and Dana Point and Irvine have grown, developed, transformed. The houses where victims lived have been sold and resold, sometimes to owners who have no idea what happened there. The streets where DeAngelo prowled in the dark are now lit differently, monitored differently, populated differently. But the past is never entirely gone. In every community touched by these crimes, there are people who remember. There are victims who still check their locks twice before sleeping. There are children, now adults, who grew up with parents who were never quite the same after that night. There are investigators who devoted years of their lives to a case that seemed unsolvable, who refused to let it go, even when retirement beckoned and younger priorities demanded attention. This is a story about a monster, yes. About a man who committed acts of terrible violence and evaded justice for 40 years. But it is also a story about the people who refused to let him win. The survivors who rebuilt their lives, the investigators who kept the evidence preserved and the case files open, the scientist and the genealogist who found a way to use DNA technology to unmask him at last. And it is a story about something deeper still, about the way communities respond to fear, sometimes badly, sometimes with remarkable courage, about the way trauma ripples outward through families and generations, about the long, slow work of justice, the way it can take decades to arrive but can arrive nonetheless. About the possibility that someone watching us, someone listening to this story, someone who has carried their own secrets for years, might finally decide that the time has come to speak. If there is a case you think deserves to be told, a story that has stayed with you, a question that has never been answered, you can share it. Sometimes the stories that matter most are the ones that have waited longest to be heard. But before we close this account, there are stories within this story that deserve to be told more fully. Details that help us understand not just what happened, but what it meant to the people who lived through it. The human cost of these crimes cannot be measured in statistics alone. Consider the Visalia years before the rapes in Sacramento had even begun. Between 1,974 and 1,975 inches, a small agricultural city halfway between Los Angeles and Sacramento, a burglar was terrorizing neighborhoods in ways that seemed bizarre rather than dangerous. He would break into homes and scatter women's undergarments across the furniture. He would steal small items, coins and trinkets, while leaving valuable jewelry untouched. He would rummage through personal belongings with an intimacy that felt violating even though nothing overtly criminal seemed to have occurred. The police called him the Visalia Ransacker, and they were frustrated by their inability to catch him despite more than 100 documented break-ins. What the Visalia police did not know then, and would not know for decades, was that they were watching the early stages of a predator learning his craft. The ransacker was studying how to enter homes undetected. He was learning the layouts of suburban neighborhoods, the patterns of residents, the response times of local law enforcement. He was taking trophies, building confidence, developing the techniques he would later use to commit far more serious crimes. The undergarments scattered across furniture were not random vandalism. They were evidence of a sexual fixation that would soon escalate from fantasy to violence. On the 11th of September, 1975, the Visalia ransacker escalated for the first time. He broke into the home of Claude Snelling, a journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias, and attempted to kidnap Snelling's 16-year-old daughter Beth from her bedroom. When Snelling confronted him, the intruder shot the professor twice and fled. Claude Snelling died in his wife's arms, the first murder victim of the man who would become the Golden State Killer. Beth Snelling, kicked repeatedly in the face during the attack, would carry the trauma for the rest of her life, not knowing who had killed her father until 43 years later. 3 months after the Snelling murder, police officer Bill McGowan was conducting a stakeout in a Visalia neighborhood when he spotted a suspicious figure. He pursued the man on foot, cornering him against a fence. The prowler pulled off his ski mask, covered his face with one hand, and spoke in a strange, high-pitched voice, saying, "Oh my God, don't hurt me. See, my hands are up." Then he pulled a gun from his jacket pocket and fired. The bullet struck McGowan's flashlight, shattering the battery and saving his life. In the confusion, the ransacker escaped over the fence and disappeared. McGowan had been face to face with the killer. He had looked into his eyes, but without the tools to identify him, without DNA or facial recognition technology, the encounter led nowhere. The Visalia ransacker simply stopped operating in Tulare County. He had learned that the area was too hot, the police too close to catching him. He needed a new hunting ground. And so in the summer of 1976, he found one in Sacramento. The first documented rape in Sacramento County occurred on the 18th of June, 1976. But there may have been earlier attacks that were never reported or connected to the series. In the 1,970 seconds, many rape victims did not come forward ashamed or afraid or convinced that they would not be believed. The stigma attached to sexual assault was overwhelming, and the criminal justice system was often hostile to victims who did report. We will never know how many women were attacked by the East Area Rapist, whose stories were never told. What we do know is that the attacks followed a remarkably consistent pattern. The rapist would select a target, usually a woman alone, or a woman with children. He would spend days or weeks surveilling the property, learning the victim's schedule, studying the layout of the home and the surrounding neighborhood. He would sometimes break in while the occupants were away, unlocking windows or doors for later access, hiding lengths of rope or twine that he would use during the attack. By the time he struck, he knew everything about his victims. Their names, their routines, the locations of telephones, the sounds they might hear and dismiss as nothing. The attacks themselves were exercises in psychological terror as much as physical violence. The rapist wanted his victims to know that he was in complete control, that their lives depended entirely on his whims. He would shine a flashlight in their eyes to disorient them. He would speak in a strange, clenched whisper that survivors found almost more disturbing than the threats he made. He would stack dishes on the backs of male victims and tell them he would hear if they moved, that he would kill everyone in the house if a single plate rattled. Some survivors reported that he would cry during the attacks, weeping and saying the name Bonnie, as though in anguish over something lost. The psychological aftermath was devastating. Survivors described being unable to sleep, unable to be alone, unable to hear certain sounds or see certain sights without being transported back to that night. Some marriages ended under the weight of the trauma. Some survivors moved away from California, entirely trying to put distance between themselves and what had happened. Some became advocates, speaking publicly about their experiences in hopes of helping catch the man responsible. Others retreated into silence, unable to discuss what had been done to them even with their closest loved ones. One survivor, identified in documents as Peggy, was attacked in 1976. Decades later at D'Angelo's sentencing hearing, she said she had never gotten over the fear that he might return, that he might have kept track of her. After 42 years, she said, "I still sleep with 2 phones and the keys on the bed when my husband is away." Another survivor, Gay Hardwick, was attacked along with her husband Bob in their Stockton home in 1978. Bob was tied up and forced to listen while his wife was assaulted in another room. At the sentencing hearing, Bob spoke about what it was like to be utterly helpless, unable to protect the person he loved most. "I was a victim," he said, "because I would have to live for the rest of my life knowing I was helpless to prevent this attack." The attacks continued relentlessly through 1977 and 1978. The rapist struck in neighborhood after neighborhood, seemingly at random but actually with careful planning. He would often call victims afterward, sometimes years afterward, reminding them that he had not forgotten them. In some cases, he would call and say nothing, just breathe into the phone until the victim hung up. In other cases, he would make threats telling women he was going to kill them or their husbands. In one documented case, he called a victim 24 years after the attack and asked, "Remember when we played?" The terror spread beyond the immediate victims. Entire communities lived in fear. Women organized into neighborhood watch groups. Men armed themselves and patrolled their streets. Hardware stores sold out of security equipment. Locksmiths worked overtime. The fear was so pervasive that it became almost impossible for anyone living in the affected areas to feel truly safe. Every strange noise at night, every unfamiliar car on the street, every hang-up phone call became a potential sign that the rapist was nearby. Law enforcement was overwhelmed and in some cases outmatched. The rapist seemed to know how police operated. He knew how long it would take for officers to respond to a 911 call. He knew where roadblocks would likely be set up and how to avoid them. He sometimes called police to taunt them, announcing that he would strike in a particular area and then evading the officers who flooded the neighborhood. Some investigators suspected that the rapist might have law enforcement training, though they had no way to prove it. Detective Carol Daly of the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department became one of the primary investigators on the case. She was one of the few female detectives working sex crimes in the county. She understood that the survivors needed more than just law enforcement. They needed someone who would listen, who would believe them, who would treat them with dignity in a system that often did neither. Daly spent thousands of hours working the East Area Rapist case. She interviewed survivors, analyzed evidence, coordinated with other jurisdictions. She kept a map on her wall with pins marking each attack, watching the pattern spread across the region. She followed leads that went nowhere and started over again. The case consumed her professional life and much of her personal life as well. Years later, after DeAngelo's arrest, Daly described the moment she learned that a suspect had been identified. "It was disbelief," she said. "And then a flood of emotions came through that for over 40 years I didn't realize was still there." The case had stayed with her for 4 decades, a weight she had carried even into retirement. The arrest lifted something she had not known she was still holding. The community response to the East Area Rapist went beyond individual fear. It fundamentally changed how people in Sacramento lived their lives. Neighborhoods that had been open and trusting became guarded and suspicious. The casual dropping by of neighbors, the easy friendliness of suburban life began to disappear. People who had never thought twice about leaving their doors unlocked began installing deadbolts and chain locks. Parents who had let their children roam freely began keeping them indoors after dark. Local newspapers ran daily stories about the rapist, and each story seemed to spread the fear further. The Sacramento Bee published composite sketches, described the attacker's methods, warned women to take precautions. In some ways, the coverage was necessary. But in other ways, the coverage amplified the terror, making the rapist seem omnipresent and unstoppable. Community meetings were held across the eastern suburbs. Residents demanded more police patrols, more resources devoted to catching the rapist. Women organized self-defense classes and neighborhood watch programs. Some survivors spoke at these meetings, sharing their experiences to help others understand the danger. It took extraordinary courage to speak publicly about what had been done to them, to face the judgment and skepticism that often greeted sexual assault survivors in that era. The fear was not limited to potential victims. Men in the community lived with their own version of the terror, a helplessness born of the rapist's apparent ability to strike anywhere, anytime without warning. Husbands who traveled for work found themselves calling home, obsessively checking that their wives and children were safe. Fathers who had always felt capable of protecting their families found themselves confronting the reality that they could not protect against this particular threat. The rapist had proven that he could enter any home, overcome any resistance, and escape without consequence. The psychological impact extended to children as well. Young people growing up in the affected areas absorbed the fear that surrounded them. They heard whispered conversations between parents, saw the new locks being installed, noticed the anxiety that entered their homes like an unwelcome guest. Some of these children, now middle-aged adults, still remember the atmosphere of those years. The sense that something terrible was loose in their community, and no one knew how to stop it. One investigator who worked the case described the community's mood as like something I had never seen before. People were afraid wherever they went. The normal rhythms of suburban life, the routines that made communities feel safe and predictable, had been disrupted by the presence of a predator who seemed to operate outside all the rules. In December 1977, a letter arrived at the Sacramento Bee containing a poem that the author claimed was written by the East Area Rapist. The poem, titled Excitement's Crave, was rambling and difficult to interpret, but it included references that seemed to fit the case. Sacramento should make an offer, one-line read, to make a movie of my life that will pay for my planned exile. Whether the poem was actually written by the rapist was never confirmed, but it added to the sense that the perpetrator was toying with the community. The Maggiore murders in February 1978 changed the nature of the investigation. Brian and Katie Maggiore were not the typical victims of the East Area Rapist. They were not attacked in their home while sleeping. They appear to have stumbled upon the rapist while he was prowling a neighborhood, perhaps preparing for another attack. The fact that he killed them rather than simply fleeing suggested a new level of danger. This was not just a rapist. This was someone willing to murder to protect himself. Detective Ray Biondi, who investigated the Maggiore case, recalled the moment when the murders were linked to the East Area Rapist. This threw a whole different light on the rape series, he said. The community's fear, already intense, ratcheted up another notch. The rapist was now a killer, and anyone who saw his face, anyone who interfered with his crimes, was potentially in mortal danger. The attacks continued for another year and a half after the Maggiore murders, spreading into the San Francisco Bay Area. The final documented Northern California attack occurred on the 5th of July 1979 in Danville. Then the trail went cold. The rapist, whoever he was, had stopped attacking in the areas where investigators had been tracking him. What no one knew at the time was that he had simply moved south. The Southern California murders were even more brutal than the crimes that had preceded them. In Northern California, the rapist had terrorized his victims but had only killed when confronted. In Southern California, killing became part of the pattern. He would break into homes, tie up the occupants, rape the women, and then bludgeon everyone to death. The victims were found bound with the same distinctive diamond knot that investigators in Sacramento had documented. The ligatures were brought to the scene, just as they had been in the earlier attacks. The methodology was unmistakably the same. Dr. Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning were killed in Goleta on the 30th of December 1979. Lyman and Charlene Smith were killed in Ventura on the 13th of March 1980. Keith and Patrice Harrington were killed in Dana Point on the 19th of August 1980. Manuela Wittoon was killed in Irvine on the 6th of February 1981. Cherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez were killed in Goleta on the 27th of July 1981. Each murder was a tragedy, and behind each murder was a family that would be shattered by loss. Keith Harrington's brother, Bruce, became a victims' rights advocate, championing Proposition 69 Inches California, which expanded the collection of DNA samples from felons. The proposition passed in 2004 and has since been used to identify suspects in thousands of cases. Bruce Harrington attended Joseph DeAngelo's sentencing hearing nearly 40 years after his brother's death, finally facing the man who had taken Keith and Patrice from him. Lyman Smith's 12-year-old son found his father and stepmother's bodies when he came to mow the lawn. The boy walked into a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The bedroom alarm clock was still going off because no one had been alive to turn it off for 3 days. Manuela Wittoon's brother, Drew, became a police officer, partly, he said, because of what had happened to his sister. He served for 20 years on the force before attending DeAngelo's sentencing hearing. Justice was served today, he said afterward. My sister can rest in peace. After the murder of Cherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez in July 1981, the attacks stopped. For nearly 5 years, there were no crimes that matched the pattern. Investigators in both Northern and Southern California wondered if the killer had died or been imprisoned for something else, or simply decided to stop. The truth, it turned out, was that he had paused. The 5-year gap between 1981 and 1986 has puzzled investigators ever since. What caused the killer to stop? Some have speculated that the birth of his second daughter in late 1981, just months after the Domingo Sanchez murders, may have changed something in him. Perhaps the responsibilities of parenthood forced him to reconsider his nocturnal activities. Perhaps the risk of being caught had grown too high. Perhaps something in his psychology shifted in a way we cannot understand. Others have suggested that the gap may not have been complete, that there may be victims we have never connected to the pattern attacks in other jurisdictions or against victims who never came forward. The killer had demonstrated remarkable discipline in avoiding detection. He knew how to cover his tracks, how to avoid leaving evidence, how to vanish after an attack. It is possible that he continued operating during those 5 years in ways that investigators have never documented. What we do know is that DeAngelo's life during those years appeared outwardly normal. He had been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 after being caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent, a strange combination of items that seems almost like a message in retrospect. After losing his law enforcement career, he found work as a mechanic at a supermarket distribution center, a job he would hold for 27 years. He lived with his wife and daughters in the Sacramento suburbs, within miles of some of the homes where he had committed his most terrible crimes. He attended his daughter's school events. He mowed his lawn. He blended into the neighborhood like any other suburban father. The ability to live such a double life speaks to something deeply disturbing about the human capacity for compartmentalization. The man who tortured and terrorized strangers in the night was also the man who drove his children to soccer practice in the afternoon. The predator who whispered threats through clenched teeth. The monster was hiding in plain sight, protected by the ordinariness of his daylight self. Some who have studied serial killers suggest that this kind of compartmentalization is actually common, that many of history's most prolific predators maintained normal-appearing lives alongside their crimes. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, was a church leader and community volunteer. John Wayne Gacy performed as a clown at children's parties. Ted Bundy worked at a suicide prevention hotline. The evil that these men committed existed alongside, not instead of the ordinary lives they presented to the world. But understanding that such compartmentalization is possible does not make it less horrifying to contemplate. The survivors of the Golden State Killer's attacks and the families of his murder victims lived for decades, not knowing who had hurt them, passing perhaps within feet of him on the street, without realizing what they were seeing. The man they feared was their neighbor, their co-worker, the parent of their children's classmates. He was there all along, hidden by the very normalcy he had constructed around himself. The cold case years from 1986 to 2018 were a strange kind of limbo for everyone involved. The survivors continued to carry their trauma, continued to flinch at certain sounds, continued to check their locks twice before sleeping. The families of murder victims continued to wonder who had killed their loved ones, continued to hope for answers that seemed increasingly unlikely. The investigators continued to review evidence, follow leads, eliminate suspects, always arriving at dead ends. Detective Larry Poole of the Orange County Sheriff's Department spent years working the original Night Stalker murders in Southern California. He developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the cases, interviewing witnesses, analyzing evidence, building psychological profiles of the unknown killer. He visited prisons to question convicted criminals who might have information. He pursued leads that came in from the public, most of them useless. The case became his obsession, the unfinished work that defined his career. Poole was among those who suspected early on that the Southern California murders might be connected to the Northern California rapes. The methodology was too similar. The diamond knot, too distinctive. But without DNA technology capable of proving the connection, the theory remained speculation. It was not until 2001 that forensic science advanced enough to confirm what Poole and others had suspected: the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. The 2001 DNA confirmation was a breakthrough, but it was also a frustration. Investigators now knew they were hunting a single perpetrator responsible for an extraordinary range of crimes. They knew his blood type, his general physical characteristics, the nature of his DNA, but they still did not know his name. The DNA profile did not match anyone in criminal databases. The killer, whoever he was, had never been arrested for anything that required DNA collection. The years that followed brought additional technological advances. The California DNA database expanded. New forensic techniques were developed. Cold case units across the state periodically reopened the investigation, reviewing old evidence with new eyes and new tools. In 2016, the FBI and local law enforcement announced a renewed nationwide effort to identify the Golden State Killer, offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to his arrest. The renewed attention brought fresh public interest, but no immediate results. Tips poured in from across the country, some promising, most useless. Investigators pursued each lead methodically, eliminating suspects one by one. The work was exhausting and often discouraging. Every suspect who turned out to be innocent was another dead end, another reminder that the killer remained free. The investigators who worked the case developed their own psychological scars. Spending years immersed in evidence of terrible crimes takes a toll that is difficult to describe to those who have not experienced it. The crime scene photographs, the autopsy reports, the recorded statements of survivors. All of this material accumulates in the mind of an investigator like sediment, layer upon layer of human suffering. Some investigators reported nightmares. Some had difficulty maintaining relationships outside of work. Some found that the case followed them even after they retired, a persistent presence that would not be dismissed. Paul Holes, who would eventually play a crucial role in identifying D'Angelo, first encountered the case in 1994 when he was working as an investigator for the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office. A rape had occurred in his jurisdiction, one of several that had been linked to the East Area rapist years earlier. Holes began reviewing the case files and became increasingly fascinated by the pattern of crimes, by the methodology of the attacker, by the sheer scope of what this unknown predator had accomplished. Over the years that followed, Holes made the Golden State Killer his personal crusade. He spent countless hours studying the evidence, interviewing survivors, walking through crime scenes that were now decades old. He developed theories about the killer's background, his motivations, his possible identity. He pushed for new forensic testing whenever technology advanced enough to make it worthwhile. He reached out to investigators in other jurisdictions, sharing information and coordinating efforts. Holes was not alone in his dedication. Across California, in sheriff's departments and district attorneys' offices and police stations, there were other investigators who had made the Golden State Killer case their mission. They met periodically to share information, compare notes, debate theories. They formed an unofficial network of people united by their determination to solve what seemed like an unsolvable case. What kept them going? The answer, when they were asked, was usually some version of the same thing: the victims. The survivors who still jumped at shadows 40 years later. The families who had never received answers about their loved ones' deaths. The communities that had lived in fear for years without ever knowing who was responsible. The investigators felt a responsibility to these people, a debt that would not be discharged until the killer was identified. Carol Daly, the Sacramento County detective, who had worked the case from its earliest days, retired without seeing it solved. Larry Poole, who had devoted years to the original Night Stalker murders, retired without seeing it solved. Dozens of other investigators who had contributed to the effort retired or died without seeing it solved. The case passed from generation to generation of law enforcement, each cohort inheriting the accumulated evidence and the accumulated frustration. And yet someone always picked it up again. Someone always reopened the files, reviewed the evidence, looked for something that might have been missed. The case had a way of drawing people in, of refusing to be forgotten. Perhaps it was the scope of the crimes, the sheer magnitude of suffering that demanded attention. Perhaps it was the mystery, the puzzle of an intelligent predator who had somehow evaded detection for decades. Perhaps it was simply stubbornness, the refusal to admit defeat in the face of a challenge that seemed insurmountable. Whatever the motivation, when genetic genealogy emerged as a viable investigative technique in 2017, the DNA evidence had been preserved. The case files were intact. The network of investigators who had worked the case over the years could be mobilized again. All that was needed was someone willing to try the new approach. Paul Holes, who was approaching retirement after more than 2 decades working on the case, decided to make one final push. He had been following the development of genetic genealogy, watching as the technique was used to identify remains of unknown persons. It occurred to him that the same approach might work for identifying suspects, tracing a DNA profile back through family trees to find a name that matched the evidence. The idea was not without complications. Genetic genealogy raised serious ethical and legal questions about privacy. But Holes believed the technique was worth trying. The alternative was continuing to watch the case go unsolved, while survivors aged and died without answers. In late 2017, Holes and genealogist Barbara Ray Venter uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch. They waited to see what would come back. The results, when they arrived, showed more than 100 distant matches, people who shared enough genetic material with the killer to suggest a family connection. Most of these matches were distant cousins, third or fourth cousins, people who shared great-great-grandparents with the unknown perpetrator. From there began the painstaking work of building family trees. Each match had to be researched, their ancestors traced backward through time, their descendants traced forward. Holes and Ray Venter looked for patterns, for bloodlines that converged, for family members who fit the general profile of the killer. White males in the right age range who had lived in California during the years when the crimes were committed. The work was tedious and often frustrating. Family records were incomplete. Names were spelled differently across generations. Some bloodlines ended without producing the right kind of match. But gradually the family trees took shape, branches connected, and eventually one family tree stood out from the rest. The tree that led to Joseph DeAngelo contained more than 1,000 names, a sprawling network of relatives extending back to great-great-great-great-grandparents who had lived in the 19th century. Holes and his team worked through the tree, systematically eliminating branches that did not fit, focusing on those that might contain their suspect. The process took months, a slow narrowing of possibilities, that eventually pointed to a small number of individuals who warranted further investigation. DeAngelo's name emerged in early 2018. He was the right age. He had lived in California during the years when the crimes were committed. He had worked as a police officer, which would explain the attacker's apparent knowledge of law enforcement procedures. His timeline matched the pattern of the crimes, with his departure from the Auburn Police Department in 1979, coinciding with the shift from Northern California to Southern California attacks. But before making an arrest, investigators needed to confirm that DeAngelo's DNA matched the samples from the crime scenes. The genetic genealogy matches were suggestive, but they were not proof. To prove that DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer, they needed his actual DNA. Meanwhile, the survivors grew older. Some of them died without ever learning who had attacked them. Their attackers' identities went with them to their graves, questions that would never be answered, closure that would never arrive. For those who remained alive, each passing year made justice seem less likely. The man who had hurt them was probably still out there, probably aging just as they were probably dying without ever being held accountable. On the 4th of May, 1986, Janelle Cruz became the Golden State Killer's final known victim. She was 18 years old, home alone while her family was on vacation in Mexico. She had recently started rebuilding her life after a troubled adolescence, working at a pizza parlor, studying to become a legal secretary, planning for a future that would never arrive. The killer entered through the garage while she was entertaining a friend. Janelle's body was found by a realtor the next evening. The brutality of the attack shocked even experienced investigators. Her family was forced to keep the casket closed at her funeral. They left California and never returned. For 32 years after Janelle Cruz's murder, the Golden State Killer was nothing more than a ghost, a shadow in the historical record, a name without a face. The evidence collected from his crime scenes sat in storage, biological samples that held the key to his identity, but could not be read with the technology available. Investigators who had worked the cases retired, grew old, passed away without ever knowing who they had been hunting. The victims lived with the knowledge that their attacker was somewhere out there, probably living a normal life, unpunished and unknown. And then science caught up with evil. The DNA revolution transformed criminal investigation in the 1,990 seconds. But the Golden State Killer's profile did not match anyone in law enforcement databases. He had never been arrested for anything serious enough to require a DNA sample. He had never been incarcerated. Whatever his crimes, he had managed to avoid leaving his genetic fingerprint anywhere that authorities could access. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. In 2017 and 2018, investigators began exploring the possibility of using genetic genealogy to identify the killer. The technique was simple in concept, but laborious in execution. By uploading the killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy database, they could find people who shared some of his genetic material, distant relatives who had submitted their own DNA in search of ancestry information. From those matches, investigators could build family trees, tracing bloodlines backward and forward, looking for someone who fit the profile of the killer. Paul Holes, the Contra Costa County investigator who led the genetic genealogy effort, worked with genealogist Barbara Ray Venter to construct the trees. They found more than 100 distant matches, third and fourth cousins of the killer. Each match required research into family histories, tracking births and marriages and deaths across generations. The family tree that eventually led to Joseph DeAngelo contained more than 1,000 names, each one carefully documented and cross-referenced. When DeAngelo's name emerged as a possible suspect, investigators had to confirm the match without alerting him. They placed him under surveillance, watching his movements, waiting for an opportunity to obtain a DNA sample without his knowledge. They collected a tissue from his garbage and a sample from his car door handle. Both matched the evidence from the crime scenes. The hunt was over. On the 24th of April 2018, law enforcement officers surrounded DeAngelo's home in Citrus Heights. The man who emerged was 72 years old, balding, shuffling, nothing like the athletic predator who had vaulted fences and outrun police 4 decades earlier. But DNA does not lie. The evidence was conclusive. Joseph James DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer. The arrest was front-page news across the country. After 40 years, one of America's most prolific serial predators had finally been identified. Survivors and victims' families, who had given up hope, suddenly had a face to attach to their nightmares. The name that had eluded investigators for decades was finally known. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented in scope. DeAngelo had committed crimes in 11 California counties over more than a decade. Prosecutors from 6 counties coordinated to bring charges. The case file grew to more than 1.3 million pages. A trial, if it went forward, was expected to take years and cost millions of dollars. In June 2020, DeAngelo accepted a plea deal. He would plead guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnappings in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He would also admit to more than 160 additional crimes for which he could not be charged because the statute of limitations had expired. The admissions were read aloud in court. A litany of terror that took hours to complete. The victim impact statements took 4 days. Survivors in their 60s and 70s, some of them attending in wheelchairs or with medical assistance, stood before the man who had attacked them and spoke about what he had done to their lives. They called him a monster, a coward, a psychopath. They described decades of fear, of broken relationships, of therapy and medication and sleepless nights. They described the strength they had found despite everything, the lives they had built, the healing they had achieved. Chris Pedretti, who was 15 when DeAngelo attacked her, told the court about the lasting impact of that December night in 1976. "Though I have found my way to a happy and safe life," she said, "DeAngelo deserves his sentence of life without parole, in the most dark and lonely containment. Your secrets have been exposed. Your double life is over. The world, and I mean the entire world, knows who you are and what you did." Jane Carson Sandler, who was raped in 1976 while her 3-year-old son was in the next room, demanded that DeAngelo look at her. He refused, keeping his eyes averted throughout the proceedings. "I want you to remember what I have to say," she told him. "You changed my life, but I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be okay." Pete Schultz spoke on behalf of his mother, Minnie Schultz, who was raped in 1976, while Pete, then a child, was tied up in another room. "Our mother is not Jane Doe. No, 22, he said. "And we are not just no, 37 uncharged offense. We are the family of Minnie Schultz, and we have all survived because of her bravery and resolve to do whatever it took to save herself and her family." Elizabeth Hupp, formerly Elizabeth Snelling, spoke about her father's murder in 1975. "My father caught him twice, peering in my bedroom window," she said. "When he came home from teaching night school, he tried to chase him down but wasn't able to catch him. And then finally, Claude Snelling caught the intruder inside his house, trying to kidnap his daughter, and was shot for his courage. DeAngelo was able to live a normal life with his family for all those years," Elizabeth said. "While my family and I could not be with my dad, I am so thankful that he will at least spend the rest of his miserable life in prison." Through 4 days of testimony, Joseph DeAngelo sat in a wheelchair, wearing an orange jail jumpsuit and a white face mask. He did not look at the people addressing him. He did not show emotion. He appeared to be performing frailty, a final mask, even as prosecutors released surveillance video showing him exercising and moving normally in his cell. On the final day, DeAngelo stood up from the wheelchair. He removed his mask. He spoke for the first and only time. "I've listened to all your statements," he said. "Each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I have hurt. Thank you, Your Honor." 19 words. After 40 years of silence, after 13 murders, and 50 rapes after terrorizing an entire state, 19 words. Judge Michael Bowman sentenced DeAngelo to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. "The impact statements will always be with me," he said. "I was moved by their grace qualities you clearly lack." He told DeAngelo that the court was not saying he did not deserve the death penalty. He was simply not receiving it because of the plea agreement. DeAngelo was transported to Corcoran State Prison in the California Central Valley. He is held in a protective unit, separated from other inmates for his own safety. Prosecutor Thien Ho has said that DeAngelo is constantly looking over his shoulder, worried that somebody's going to attack him. So he's in his own version of hell, where he belongs. The case of the Golden State Killer changed criminal investigation forever. Genetic genealogy. The technique that identified DeAngelo has since been used to solve hundreds of cold cases across the United States. Families who had given up hope of ever learning who killed their loved ones have received answers. Survivors who never thought they would see justice have watched their attackers taken into custody. The technique has also raised serious questions about privacy and the ethics of using public DNA databases for law enforcement purposes. When people upload their genetic information to sites like GEDmatch, hoping to find distant relatives or trace their ancestry, they are also potentially providing information that could be used to identify their family members, including family members who might prefer to remain unknown. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated the power of this approach, but it also demonstrated the trade-offs involved. For the survivors and families in this case, those trade-offs were worth it. After decades of fear and uncertainty, they finally knew who had attacked them. They finally had the opportunity to speak their truth to the man responsible. They finally saw him held accountable, if not for everything he had done, then at least for enough of it to ensure he would never walk free again. Michelle McNamara, who gave the Golden State Killer his name and spent years trying to identify him, did not live to see the arrest. She died 2 years before DeAngelo was identified, consumed by the obsession that drove her work. In the final pages of I'll Be Gone in the Dark, written before her death and completed by others afterward, she addressed the killer directly. "You will be caught," she wrote. "I may no longer be here. I may have died. I may be in a nursing home drooling oatmeal. But this story will not end with me. I know it. I feel it. It will end with you. The bedroom door closing. Your face. Your name. A flood of flashbulbs awaits you." She was right. The story ended with him. And the man who had promised to be gone in the dark was dragged into the light. There is something profound about the idea that stories can survive their storytellers, that the work of seeking truth continues even when individual seekers fall. Michelle McNamara poured years of her life into hunting the Golden State Killer. She exhausted herself chasing leads, interviewing victims, building timelines. And though she did not live to see the conclusion, her work contributed to the momentum that eventually brought Joseph DeAngelo to justice. Her name is now permanently linked to his not as a victim but as an adversary, as someone who refused to let him escape into history unnamed. For the survivors, life continues. Some have written books about their experiences. Some have become advocates for victims' rights. Some have retreated from public attention, preferring to process their healing privately. The bonds formed among them during the decades of uncertainty, the community created by shared trauma, persist even now. They are connected by an experience none of them chose, transformed into witnesses to something larger than themselves. One survivor, speaking at the sentencing hearing, said something that captures the complexity of what the survivors faced and what they found. "Today," she said, "I am not just a broken survivor of a cold case murder. Today, I am a victor in the battle between good and evil." Victory is a complicated word in this context. Joseph DeAngelo destroyed lives that can never be fully restored. The dead cannot be brought back. The trauma cannot be entirely healed. The years spent in fear and uncertainty cannot be returned. Whatever justice was achieved in that Sacramento courtroom was incomplete justice, imperfect justice. Justice that arrived decades too late for many who needed it most. And yet it was still justice. The man who had escaped accountability for 40 years was finally held accountable. The survivors who had wondered if they would ever know his name finally knew it. The families who had buried loved ones without knowing who killed them finally had answers. Something that had been broken was, if not repaired, at least acknowledged. The universe had been slightly corrected. The Golden State Killer case reminds us that time works differently in matters of justice than it does in ordinary life. Wounds that seem old to the world remain fresh to those who bear them. Evidence that seems stale can still speak, waiting for the right ears to hear it. Answers that seem impossible can still arrive even after hope has faded. If you are listening to this story, perhaps you carry wounds of your own. Perhaps you have waited for answers that never came. Perhaps you have wondered whether the truth would ever emerge, whether the person who hurt you, or someone you loved, would ever be held accountable. This story offers no guarantees. Many cases remain unsolved forever. Many survivors never see justice. But this story also offers something that matters. The reminder that closure is possible, even after decades. The demonstration that persistence in science and the refusal to give up can sometimes break through walls that seemed permanent. The proof that stories can reach their proper endings, even when those endings seem impossibly far away. Joseph James DeAngelo will die in prison. He will never experience freedom again. He will spend whatever remains of his life surrounded by walls and guards, his crimes a matter of public record, his name synonymous with evil. The man who moved through the night unseen is now watched constantly. The man who terrorized thousands now lives in fear himself. That is what justice looks like: imperfect and partial, and still better than its absence. That is what the survivors fought for, waited for, and finally received. That is what was owed to the dead and to the living, to the communities that spent years in fear, to the investigators who never gave up, to the writer who did not live to see her work completed. The story of the Golden State Killer is finished now. The door has closed. The name has been spoken. The light has fallen on the man who promised to vanish into darkness. If there is a case you think deserves to be told, a story that has stayed with you, a question that has never been answered, sometimes the stories that matter most are the ones that have waited longest to be heard.